Steckelberg, Mark Edwards, Mark Belichick, Mike McDaniel, Larry Reynolds, with support from Scott Hippica, Matt Papadoulis, and Nick Payne from my office. At the excellent suggestion of Mark Belichick, we're going to be adding Jill Nylander or a member of her staff from Legal Services of East Michigan to help us on some legal issues. We had our first organizational meeting, listened to the concerns, and essentially dropped them into two buckets. The first being rental property managers that have not paid their water bills. I'm too close to the microphone. And are now being threatened with shutoffs, which could jeopardize the tenants. The second category, and probably the larger, rental property managers and owners that have paid their water bills, received the credit, but have not passed on the credit to the tenants that have paid for water as part of their rental agreement. Initially, we confirmed that it did not appear that either issue arises in MSHDA-funded or regulated facilities. We have discussed support from the philanthropic community to assist tenants threatened by evictions, and I think some of that, I'm looking at Steve, some of that keyed in earlier this week. The subcommittee in their discussions recognized the City of Flint has made significant advancements towards commercial collection rates, and now we're sort of getting to the outliers. Steve Branch and the city are gathering information on the scope of the challenge in each of those categories. How many instances do we believe exists? How many tenants? How many properties? What stage are they in? The state team is exploring how and whether the property managers at those facilities are licensed and determine if we have any leverage there. As I said, we had our first organizational meeting. We're currently scheduling the next one. I'm looking at Steve hopefully next week, although I still don't have the date iced yet. Once we have sort of better data on the scope of the problem in each category, I think we'll look at different strategies. Any questions?
Any questions for Mike? Okay, thanks, Mike, and thanks for leading that effort. So now we have Lieutenant Governor on the Child Lead Poisoning Elimination Board.
Thank you. I wanted to give an overview, but to set the stage with respect to the conclusions of the report and ask you to consider a major paradigm shift from the way that we look at lead poisoning today and the way that we're hoping that our entire system will change to in the future. Today we respond and react to incidents of lead poisoning, and what the purpose, the main goal behind this, overarching goal behind this report, is to shift it to prevent poisoning from happening in the first place, and there are several aspects of making that happen, and even in the cases where we're looking to expand and to be more effective on the response, we still want that to aid in prevention. And so I'll give you an example. One of the things that, since it was the headline in the Associated Press story, it got the most attention, something as direct as going back to universal screening of children at certain ages for lead poisoning. That is a way to detect lead poisoning that has already happened. But that information could be very valuable if we had a model, a statistical model to feed that information into, to use it to predict where lead poisoning might happen in the future, given other characteristics that can be brought together to make a system like that operate. So universal screening was one of those goals. I would point out that in Detroit, for example, where as awareness of the potential of lead poisoning had spread across the land, that they had many more people, an effort to get more people tested, more kids tested, and they were very successful in that. And you might expect that if you had more people tested, that the percentage of lead poisoning detected would go down, right? The numerator of the fraction went up. You would expect maybe the overall percentage will go down. That is not what happened, and that tells us that there are a lot of kids out there that are exposed in various different ways that our system today doesn't detect. So this idea of going back to universal screening is very important, but that is not the the main overarching goal of the report, again, is to get to the point where you're eliminating the risk in the first place. Now, in order to do that, we have to look at all the various aspects of where lead contamination exists and where people come in contact with lead. And even as in a lot of places where lead investigations happen in response to a lead poisoning incident, the tests don't always include the water system. But one of the recommendations of this group is to ensure that those investigations do include water tests. But here in Flint, where it has included water tests, in the vast majority of cases, it was not only was it not the only place where a child came in contact with lead or had that in their environment, that in many of the cases the lead was not detectable in the water, and yet the child was still lead poisoned. And so it's a wake-up call that we need to take a very comprehensive approach, that the water infrastructure is part of that comprehensive approach, but paint, dust, and soil and air in some cases need to be part of this solution if we are to get to the goal of elimination of lead poisoning altogether. So we're looking for so the detection and response is part of it. Having a more robust system for detection and response is part of the recommendation of the report. But we're also looking to take advantage of things that are happening on a regular basis out there in the world, and look for those intervention opportunities to make a difference that won't rely necessarily on a particular state program or a line item, something like the sale or the transfer of a home. That when a piece of real estate goes from ownership of one person to another person, that's a great opportunity to evaluate what the risks are in that home. And of course, this happens in so many different ways already. If a person, in fact, there are some loan programs that require a determination of risks of lead in homes already today, but that's not the vast majority of home transfers. And so in home inspections, for example, a very common thing, what if they included inspections that determined what the risks were with respect to lead, and those and then you'd have some market-driven changes that didn't have to wait for wouldn't have to wait for a program or detection or lead poisoning in order to take care of the problem. Now, we do, aside from our own internal efforts, which have been ramped up over recent years, and implementation efforts that I expect in future years out of the state budget, we also were very fortunate to receive a very substantial federal grant award as well to begin this work. So I think that the implementation of this report will be seriously and substantially aided by the resources from several different levels that will bring it to bear. Now let's talk a little bit about the bringing information together in order to predict where lead poisoning exists and prevent it from where the risks are, and then prevent it from happening in the first place. We had several members of the team got together with different entities that have data. And what we found is that the information is out there. It's just not in the same place, and it's not really put together in a way that would predict where the risks exist. And so Dr. Like Thompson from Wayne State University, who is a part of the group, has done some great work already in neighborhoods in Detroit in identifying where risk exists and where it comes from. And if we were to pick a few pilot communities and take all the information we have where lead poisoning is known to exist, when houses were built. In our assessing information, we have information about condition of the housing as another factor that we know is can increase risks of exposure to lead for the people living in those houses, and the histories of those properties, to bring all this data together and use it to create a profile, if you will, of the type of house that is more likely to result in the poisoning of the people that live in that house. And so that work is, even though one of the recommendations is start a commission to drive the implementation of these goals, to have a permanent commission put back in place. We used to have one years ago, but to have a permanent commission back in place to drive the work and make sure that that every day we're making steps toward the goal of elimination of lead poisoning altogether. I know, because I've been in communication with him recently, that Dr. Thompson's not waiting for that. That commission is already doing a lot of this work and getting it ready. It's very exciting because it just seems like everybody who potentially could be a part of it is not just willing but driven to be a part of making this happen. And now there are some regulatory aspects of it as well. The report is very substantial in terms of the scope, the depth, and the number of recommendations, because keep in mind the goal is not the Child Lead Poisoning Reduction Board, it's the Child Lead Poisoning Elimination Board. And so this is going to take a sustained, long-term push, and there are some regulatory components to that. I'll say in particular, rental properties. Now I can only give you anecdotally information at this point that it just seems like rental properties are a big part of the problem, at least with the lead poisoning incidences that we detect today, and so there are some tools that I think are already in place, and maybe the enforcement needs to be beefed up, and also some additional authorities that might need to be gained in order to take care of the problem and to protect that next generation. So that's the end of my report. I'd be happy to take questions. And well, actually, let me say thank you. Dr. Mona was on the board, and as well as Dr. Wells. Is there anybody else in here? I didn't see anybody else that was on the board in the room. But thank you for your service and valuable insight and passion to keep it, to really make it an aspirational type of a document, that we had a room full of people that refused to accept or be limited by budgetary or political conditions and realities and struggles, but just said that we want this to be the sort of thing that is that describes what the perfect world looks like. In a perfect world, these are the things that we would do, and so those are our goals.
Dr. Atisha?
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. If I can just say thank you. So I applaud the Lieutenant Governor and his leadership for creating this task force, leading it, and coming up with this really robust set of recommendations. I think our water crisis that we're very much still in the middle of has really had several silver linings, and it's given us a chance to look at the entire state, look at lead elimination for all children, and it's really also sparked some national repercussions. Last Monday, there was a National Lead Summit, the first of its kind. Dr. Pugh was there as well, where people from all over the country were on the heels of Flint. We're looking at how to eliminate lead exposure, and really using our blueprint as a model of recommendations that can be put in place. And even just yesterday, there was another meeting in D.C. just looking at lead elimination and what we need to be doing. The tools are there, the recommendations are there, and I look forward to turning what's on paper into policy. We definitely can't end here. There's lots of tangible things that we can do to protect all of our children, especially our most vulnerable ones. We know that this is an environmental injustice. Our kids in Flint, our kids in Detroit, our kids in Grand Rapids, some of our most vulnerable kids in this state and our nation are already burdened with something they don't need to be burdened by. So thank you. I applaud these efforts, and I look forward to really beginning this work.
Mr. Jones?
Yeah, I really appreciate Dr. Hanatisha talking about the policy piece, and that's really my question is, based on the recommendations here, can you talk a little bit about the policy recommendations and kind of what strategies will be employed to actually make those policies a reality so that we put this whole thing behind us?
There are a lot of them, but let me give you a few that I consider to be essential in making the biggest amount of difference in the shortest period of time. With respect to detection, universal screening, going back to a point of universal screening is going to give us important information about how to find that source of contamination and to eliminate it, but then to also predict where else it might be and to get ahead of it there as well. And then as we look at things that commonly or either commonly happen or are required to happen at the time when a property changes hands, and then also I'll throw in there at a point when a property changes tenants, that these are intervention opportunities that some places, well, for example, the city of Detroit has an ordinance which is actually quite good, but its enforcement of it and implementation of it is quite challenging. So there will be there's an infrastructure framework that will need to be built as well, and that's to accommodate the policy changes. But I think that's really where the story is going to be told, is finding all of the opportunities for intervention when something happens with a property. And those are points when there are already touch points with state and local governments, and so those are the points where I think we're going to be able to really to change policy in order to require things to just happen automatically at that point. And then the other thing I'll mention as well that I didn't put in my original comments is there are things that today happen in the regular course of programs that we run that aren't necessarily thought of as lead elimination opportunities that we've identified as potentials, and I'm sure that there are many more that will be identified in the future. But just as an example, there are energy efficiency programs that replace windows. Like, we help people replace windows. And that's not really connected today in terms of qualification and so forth to lead contamination, but what if it was? And if we were to have that type of a coordinated management plan to where one of the factors we consider with the energy efficiency window replacement, because windows that have lead contamination are probably pretty inefficient too. And so that's just an example of something that's already happening out there that could be more targeted toward helping with this goal of eliminating lead as well.
Dr. Edwards.
Let me just say that Michigan is on its way to a national leadership position in terms of the new lead and copper rule. And I hope also that there'll be a leader in the water rate issue as a result of the Flint tragedy. And I think one thing that they could also consider being a leader in, and in fact you already are, is lead pipe elimination. So I think it was last week Lansing finally replaced their last lead pipe, and that took 12 years of work. And Flint hopefully is going to be on its way, but you have a lot of lead pipes in Michigan, and as long as those lead pipes are there, this committee knows better than anyone else that you have a hazard. And when I heard it mentioned that, a lot of homes with elevated blood lead children had undetectable lead in the water, we have to recognize that was the time it was sampled, and that we know in Flint that you can get a lot of non-detects in a home and then get a single glass of water with so much lead in it, it's the equivalent of eating like 5 to 10 lead paint chips. And that single glass of water could cause elevated blood lead. That's the nature of this issue. So I'm just hoping that Michigan can continue its leadership role in lead pipe replacement across the state. You're on your way. It's a problem that the rest of the country has to deal with. As long as those lead pipes are there, you have a hazard. It doesn't matter what the water testing shows.
Thank you, Jim.
Yes, we have a system now in regards to changing of ownership of homes, that there's a seller's disclosure form. But recently I found out, working with my granddaughter to buy a house, that on repossessions, lending institutions are exempt from doing that. And when you're looking at older houses for younger people buying with usually young children, if we do this with lead, I would encourage that they not be exempt from doing an owner's disclosure, because there's a lot of those houses out there that the younger people are buying with children, are exempt from the disclosure. And it's pretty easy to see if one were to look, if you have a lead service line going into the house, that's pretty easy to detect. Not so easy, but if it's an older house in an older area, chances are their service line from the main is lead.
Yeah, and I'll say that the board actually went further than recommending disclosure, that it's mere disclosure. I mean, there are so many things disclosed when you buy a house. The chances
Yes.
of absorbing all of it is very small for most transactions. So it goes beyond there are certain things that should happen at the time, and it's more than just disclosure that you might expect some sort of lead contamination to exist. Also, the board did, Dr. Edwards, adopt all of the recommendations with respect to the water infrastructure that were adopted or endorsed by this board. So complete elimination of the lead pipe infrastructure was I think on the first day accepted as do all those things, and now all the non-water things we also need to do.
Mr. Jones?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Did I hear someone say that Dr. Pugh was a part of this board? The committee that did this? Okay, all right. So one of the other things that concerns me, and I'm really looking forward to reading this, is I know that there's a lot of focus placed on homes that may have lead paint or may have windows, older windows, and that kind of thing. I'm also concerned about some of the apartment complexes that might decline a rental inspection and how young people are exposed to lead through those facilities. And so some of you may know that the city of Flint has been really having a tough time with apartment complexes. Some of them have been denying rental inspections, and others have been accepting money for rent that is supposed to include water and gas, but not paying those utility bills. And so there's really no enforcement authority to actually make them comply with those things. And so as we think about this, I'm also very concerned about the number of young people that live in these apartments and they're not being inspected. And so that becomes another place where they're exposed to lead. And so I would ask you to think about not only legislation or policy that might force them to have the inspections done, but also enforcement authority for communities so that they can force these people to comply, if that makes sense.
Mike, is that something your subcommittee could add? Is it?
I would actually just recommend that I think you'll find that the report does make specific recommendations with respect to rental properties, because we did find, again, there's not like a central database of this that exists right now, but at least anecdotally, we found that rental properties, and that might be a house, it might be an apartment complex, but people that are you have single buildings or locations that have resulted in lead poisoning over and over and over again. And so clearly there's either not enough regulatory authority, or the enforcement of that authority that exists is not good enough. And so this is I think this will be a major part of the solution, and help a population that seems to be more exposed than those that own their own homes.
So in one case, we have an apartment complex that hasn't had a rental inspection for a couple decades now. And when we talked about kind of what authority we have to force them to do that, we ran out of options. And we took this apartment complex to court, and the property owner would just not show up. And so they were able to get away with this. And so the options for enforcement and forcing this person to comply were very limited. And so I would ask that, we would think about how do we make sure that communities have the authority to force these folk to comply. Because if they go to court and it's just a civil infraction and it's thrown out, then you really don't have the authority to do much, and they can continue to ignore that. But if there's another way to I'll just ask us to think about that.
Mike?
The lead and copper rule revisions that we discussed previously do have something, and I should work with the Lieutenant Governor on this. We actually have a bill draft that people are reviewing that requires in rental property water examinations and notifications before a property can be rented.
Is that bill draft available to?
Pardon me?
Is it?
I can get you one.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. It's in draft form. It's probably got some typos, but I'll get you one.
I guess I'm thinking about rental inspections broadly.
Okay.
Harvey?
Governor?
Yeah, to go to your comment, Sylvester, in particular, what we found, it's not just a Flint issue it's a broader issue that we're looking at already that we've discovered from small communities in Michigan, and it's the whole topic of code enforcement. So it applies to more than just rental inspections, and what we're finding is there's a wide array of things. That's everything from communities are unclear as to what the law is in some cases, or what resources they need, or what's qualified resources for enforcement. Going to your point, what's civil versus criminal, what the state law is. So that's something we've already undertaken some review of in a very broad base, so we'll be happy to plug you into that. And it really came out of many smaller county seats having that issue with particularly rental housing.
Any other questions for Lieutenant Governor? I just have one observation. So I'm looking at the one page in terms of the associated costs, and you have adult crimes related to childhood lead. So could a criminal analysis, for example, in some cities, we have several cities in our state, be a trigger for more aggressive action in terms of looking at lead? It doesn't solve the crime problem today, but perhaps it could prevent something in the future.
If you were to look at virtually any major social problem that we deal with, crime, reading rates, poverty, and you were to overlay a map over map over map, you would find a pretty strong correlation between communities that struggle with these things and those that have a higher risk of lead poisoning. But I do want to say that that there's I don't want it to be considered that it's only an urban issue too, because it seems to be that that the correlation with low income or poverty rates, which includes very rural places as well, may also be an important factor. But that's the reason why this is the very beginning of the work, and there's all this information out there, but it's not put into the same place and run through a system to really develop to develop those correlations and to maybe find causations, but especially to help us predict where problems are and how to get in front of them. And that's what when I look at this whole report, there's all kinds of important things, but what I'm really excited about is the ability to be to put the resources in places where it's going to make the biggest difference in the shortest period of time, and to just build on it from there. And so I think the information is there, it's out there, a lot of different aspects to it. And but there just does seem to be a strong correlation between a lot of the major issues that we work with in places that have higher incidence of lead poisoning.
Thank you, and thanks for your leadership on this issue. So we're going to the next item. Are there any other member concerns that we didn't discuss today that you want to briefly bring up before we move the agenda? General McDaniels.
I just want to give a update on the service line replacement within the city of Flint. Currently, we are at 625 lines replaced. That is slower than we had expected, but the weather has slowed us up in the last couple of weeks. We had sort of hit our mark in October and November where we were replacing 50 lines a week, and that's the pace we wanted to be. So the weather has slowed us down. We have not yet stopped for the year. We are doing it day to day. There are two major concerns. One is the pipes freezing. The crews are using wrapping the pipes when they're exposed in heat blankets, and we are working very closely with the city streets department to assure that we're not blocking any streets. Obviously, the safety for motorists on the city streets comes first, and so we have to do that on a day-by-day basis. One other comment I would make is that although we're at 625, we've dug 700 holes. We've had 75 lines that turned out to be copper to copper, and that's a much higher rate than we want to see. So we have done a small amount of hydrovacking where we just go in and make a very, a less intrusive hole in the tree lawn and determine in both directions what sort of lines that we have. But we need to do that on a much greater basis and do that before we issue our next RFP so that we have some sense of where, what areas we're going into. In one way, it's a good problem because as we started out, we knew we had areas that were totally lead, and we've taken care of those areas in the first 500 or so, and now it's a matter of determining exactly where we have the greatest density of lead pipes or partial lead pipes replacing. And so we wanted to solve that problem before we start our next RFP for 2017, where we are working with the city and doing sort of an omnibus RFP for the entire year, thanks to the money provided by the state. Thank you.
Thanks, General McDaniels. And Nick?
Mike just referenced it at the end, but we received approval for our CHIP funding request. That was the funding that Lieutenant Governor referenced when he was talking. This is sort of a landmark improvement in health that we worked with the federal government on. I want to thank the governor and the lieutenant governor for their support in pushing us in this direction. What this is really going to allow us to do is really look at all the factors that we're talking about today and fund it with joint federal and state money, which is a little bit different from what we've seen out of our federal partners, where generally these programs have been more after the fact and for treatment. So this is a real move towards prevention and a real move, I think, will be the most significant factor in eliminating the presence of lead in the environment that we've seen. So thank you for all of your support.
Okay, and one more quick comment, Dr. Sullivan.
Yeah, the flushing program that we've had at the hydrants, has that ended now that we've gotten to these cold temperatures and we don't want to cause icing on the roads? I'm wondering if that's ended, and I'm wondering, will we be watching to see the impact of that on chlorine levels and those kinds of things now that we can't flush until the temperatures go up again?
Can George or someone give a quick response to that?
Go ahead.
Or Bryce?
Go ahead.
So yes, we watch those things daily. The city does, also US EPA, also DEQ staff. So we're watching those daily. And the city stopped flushing and EPA has stopped flushing, yes.
Okay, and next meeting is at the Riverfront Banquet Center on January the 20th. With that, Governor?
Sure. I want to thank everyone for being here, but also hopefully you can have a chance to see all the different efforts going on, that there's a multitude of different tracks. To deal with a tragedy like this, it's important to parallel process. It's not about just doing one thing, but creating sort of separate tracks to deal with the variety of issues and challenges we face, but they interlink and weave together. And so that's hopefully where we can see a lot of value, and that's the point of this group. And that's why it is great we get together to talk about these things. If you put it in context, we've seen a tremendous amount of water infrastructure improvement in terms of short-term water quality, but we have to continue to remove the lead service lines. So I want to thank the general and the city for their efforts to make that happen. There's a lot of work going on for the long-term water supply. In addition to simply getting access to water, it's the cost of the water. So that's another layer that fits into this whole situation that's imperative it be done the right way. But as you start taking on these issues, That leads into the whole lead elimination issue, and that's where I want to thank the Lieutenant Governor and the members for their work on that front. That was just a starting point to really get the board together, the task force, to come up with recommendations. But you can see it gets into another series of issues. So it talks about water, but it's beyond water. It gets into the real estate world, particularly rental housing. And that's a trend we've been watching. I mentioned what we were doing in smaller communities to let you know this is not unique to urban areas by any means. And so we're seeing a lot of crossover with these kind of topics, not only with rental properties, but the poverty interlink. And so there's a lot of good work we can do on that front with respect to how do you address these things and where do you pick the intervention points and how do you do it in an effective fashion. And I would reiterate, it's much like Dr. Edwards said, lead service lines don't get solved overnight, but if you come up with a concentrated, thoughtful process over a period of time, you can do a lot. And so that's the approach we need to take there. And in fact, one of the things we just accomplished yesterday through the legislature on energy legislation links right back into what the Lieutenant Governor said with energy efficiency. So we actually did some unique things to help renters with energy efficiency. It ties right back into this window replacement, some of the other replacement programs. So it all ties together. And that's why it's important we keep this dialogue going about how we all talk together. I appreciate that Dr. mentioning our infrastructure report. Thank you for your service on that. That shows one of the things we can learn out of this tragic crisis is we can improve the entire state of Michigan. So the Infrastructure Commission did a wonderful report, came out about a week ago or so. It's a roadmap for the next 30 to 50 years for the state of Michigan. But I can tell you, and I think it'll get reinforced by people that were there and people that looked at it, it's the best report in the United States on infrastructure. So again, that's one of the outcomes of what we've dealt with here, that we can help a lot of people in a lot of different places. The last thing I would add is I'm looking forward to the new legislative session. They had a full plate already, but this will be our opportunity to really get things introduced on the lead and copper rule and to push ahead on some of the good recommendations because we'll have a clean pipeline to start with after the first of the year in terms of things we can move forward with. So it'll be a good opportunity to work on these issues over 2017 on how we improve all the state of Michigan and continue some hopefully national leadership on these critical topics. So I wish everyone happy holidays and safe holidays. I appreciate all the great work this group has done and the people that are working behind the scenes with all of you. So thank you.
We adjourn. Thanks.